There is a rule inside the Crimson Palace. Become the furniture. Eyes down, feet silent, breath unheard. Especially when vampires older than the kingdom itself are deciding whether an empire lives or bleeds out by morning. But when the royal scribe's hands began to tremble, turning a death sentence into a toast, one maid broke 5 centuries of silence. Lyra poured the king's wine and whispered, "Your royal scribe lied." The crimson throne hall smelled of beeswax candles, aged blood wine, and something colder underneath, fear, dressed up as diplomacy. Lyra stood near the gold-veined pillar behind the high table, a crystal decanter balanced against her forearm, her spine straight, her eyes lowered to the black marble. Her calves ached from 6 hours on her feet, a small human complaint in a room full of creatures who hadn't felt tired in centuries. But you didn't shift your weight in this hall. You didn't sigh. You were a shadow who happened to know how to pour without a drop spilled onto a 200-year-old cloth. At the head of the table sat King Valar Duscrin. He didn't look like the stories. No fangs bared for show. No cruelty carved into his face. He wore black robes stitched in dark gold thread, a crimson crown resting easy on white hair, and eyes that carried 347 years of war. He was tired of fighting. His hands lay flat and still on the table, patient, almost gentle. Lyra had served him 1,000 nights and never once seen him raise his voice. Across from him sat Duke Zephyrin Morvain, a delegate from the northern courts, his smile wide and warm, and entirely wrong. Beside him, Lord Saradin Valecrest said nothing at all, which was somehow worse, and Lord Kedrick Noctar drummed his fingers against his goblet like he was already counting down to violence. Between the 2 thrones sat Orsim Malek, the royal scribe, translator of the ancient blood tongue for nearly 30 years, a man Valar trusted the way you trust your own reflection. Lyra had watched him wipe his palms against his robe 4 times since the first course. She told herself it was nerves. Diplomacy did that to gentle men. Then Zephyrin leaned toward Saradin and murmured, low in the old tongue, "The king still suspects nothing." Orson turned to Valar and said, "His grace remarks on your majesty's wisdom." Lyra's hand did not shake, but something inside her chest folded in on itself. She wasn't supposed to understand a single word of the ancient blood tongue, a language reserved for royal bloodlines, forbidden to servants on pain of execution. But her grandmother had been royal translator once before age took her, and in the last winter of her life, she had taught Lyra every syllable in secret candle by candle, warning her. One day, words will become sharper than swords. Lyra had been 11. She hadn't understood. She understood. Now, she moved along the table, refilling goblets, cataloging the gap between what was said and what was repeated. Valar offered open borders. Orson softened it into territorial goodwill. Valar demanded honesty in the terms. Orson translated it as flexibility. Each lie was small enough to miss. Together they were reshaping a peace treaty into a leash. "It's not your place," she told herself, moving back toward the pillar, decanter trembling faintly against her palm. "You are a maid. You have a mother in the lower quarter who needs you breathing, not buried for treason." But she looked at Valar, really looked, and saw a king who wanted peace badly enough to hand his throat to a man he trusted. She recognized that particular exhaustion. She saw it in the mirror some mornings. Zen Zephyrin spoke again, quieter this time, almost bored, reaching for his wine. "He signs the covenant tonight. He does not see the dawn." Orson's voice, to the king, was warm as firelight. "His grace says tonight begins an eternal friendship." Valar reached for the blood covenant. His hand hovered above the parchment. Lyra stepped forward with the decanter, moved to the king's side the way she'd moved 1,000 nights before. Silent, practiced, invisible. She filled his goblet. She did not meet his eyes. She set the vessel down. "You royal scribe lied," she whispered. The hall went still enough to hear the candles burn. Orson's mouth stayed open around an unfinished word. Valar did not startle. He turned his head slowly, the way something ancient turns when it finally notices a sound it should have heard sooner, and asked, in a voice terrifyingly calm, "What did you say?" And that was the moment. The invisible maid stopped disappearing. Valar's question hung in the air, but Lyra had barely finished setting the decanter down when the trumpet sounded, the formal call to order, and the moment folded itself back into ceremony. The king lowered his hand. The negotiations were beginning. Whatever answer he wanted from her would have to wait until the wine was poured and the treaty properly opened. Lyra retreated to her pillar, heart still hammering, and watched the true danger of the night unfold. Zephyron rose first, inclining his head with practiced grace, and began speaking, not in the common tongue, but in the low, ancient cadence reserved for royal blood. The ancient blood tongue rolled through the hall like smoke, and every noble present understood by long tradition that only 3 creatures in this room could translate it: Zephyran himself, silent Lord Saradin at his side, and Orson, standing dutifully at Valar's shoulder with his ledger open and his quill trembling. No one else was supposed to understand a word. Lyra understood every word. She kept her eyes on the floor, her hands folded, her breathing even, while inside her chest a second conversation ran parallel to the one everyone else believed they were hearing. "Your Majesty," Zephyrin said aloud in the old tongue, "the northern courts wish only for peace, open trade along the Duskring coast, protection of mutual borders, a treaty written in good faith, blood to blood." Valar inclined his head, waiting. Orson cleared his throat and offered the common tongue translation, his voice smooth as poured wine. "His Grace offers peace, Your Majesty. Open trade, mutual protection, a treaty of good faith." It was almost right. Almost. But Lyra had heard Zephyrin's actual words a half-second earlier, and something in the phrasing had shifted. Protection of mutual borders had quietly become, in Orson's mouth, protection for the northern courts. One word, a single possessive, moved from one house to another. Valar wouldn't notice. Nobody would notice. That was the entire design of a lie this well built. It survived on things too small to catch. Lyra filed it away and kept pouring. Valar spoke next, his voice measured, sincere. "Tell the Duke I want honest terms. No hidden garrisons. No soldiers behind velvet curtains. If we build peace, we build it in the open." Orson turned, translated it into the old tongue for Zephyran, and this time, Lyra caught the deeper wound. No hidden garrisons became, in Orson's rendering, a request phrased almost as an apology, softened into the king hopes for discretion in troop movement. Not honesty, discretion. The exact opposite of what Valar had asked for. Lyra's grip on the decanter's handle tightened. Across the table, Zephyrin leaned toward Saradin, his lips barely moving, his voice pitched for no one but the man beside him. "The king still suspects nothing," Zephyrin murmured in the old tongue, and there was amusement threaded through it, the particular boredom of a man who has already won. Orson's quill scratched against the ledger. He straightened, addressed Valar with a small, respectful bow. "His Grace remarks that the king is wise to move carefully in matters of trust." Lyra nearly laughed, not from humor, but from the sheer vertigo of it. The king still suspects nothing had become, "The king is wise." A death sentence dressed as a compliment, delivered with a bow. She moved along the table, refilling goblets she didn't need to refill, using the motion as cover to stay close enough to hear. She began, quietly, methodically, to keep 2 ledgers of her own. The real conversation in one column of her mind, the false one. Orson fed the king in the other. The gap between them widened with every exchange. Peace became surrender. Protection became exposure. Every phrase Valar offered in good faith arrived on the other side of the table gutted of its meaning, and every threat Zephyrin offered arrived in Valar's ears sanded down into courtesy. It wasn't carelessness. It wasn't even nerves anymore. The way she'd first assumed watching Orson's trembling hands. This was design. 30 years of trust, and Orson was spending every coin of it tonight, deliberately, sentence by sentence. She thought of her grandmother's voice, worn thin by the end. One day, words will become sharper than swords. She hadn't understood it as a child. She understood it now. Standing 3 feet from a king was about to sign his own death with a smile on his face. The final course arrived. Servants cleared the plates in practiced silence. Zephyrin lifted his goblet, and beneath the warm candlelight, beneath the low murmur of a hall that believed itself on the edge of historic peace, he spoke again to Saradin, quieter this time, almost lazy. A man setting down a winning hand. "He signs tonight?" Zephyrin said in the old tongue, swirling the blood wine in his glass. "He dies before sunrise." Orson turned to the king, his face composed into something warm, something trustworthy, something Valar had relied on for 3 decades. "His Grace says," Orson told him gently, "that tonight begins an eternal friendship." The decanter in Lyra's hands tilted. Wine kissed the rim of the goblet she was filling, one heartbeat from spilling across the white linen and every eye in the hall. She caught it, Barely, her knuckles white around the crystal, her pulse a drumbeat in her throat. Valor reached for the treaty resting at the center of the table, his fingers brushing the parchment's edge. Lyra stepped back into the shadow of the pillar, and for the first time in 5 years of practiced invisibility, she understood that silence was no longer a way to survive the night. It was the thing that would end it. Valor's fingers lingered on the edge of the parchment without lifting it. He wasn't ready yet. Not quite. And Lyra, watching from the shadow of the pillar, realized he wanted to savor this moment a little longer. He wanted to believe in it first. "Tell the Duke," Valor said, and his voice carried a weight that had nothing to do with formality. "That I remember the long winter war. I remember losing 1,100 soldiers at Ashvale in a single week, boys who had never held anything sharper than a quill before we armed them. I remember the villages along the Thornreach burning for 3 nights because 2 courts couldn't agree on a border. I do not want that world for my son. If I am ever fortunate enough to have one, I want this treaty to be the last treaty either of our houses ever needs." It was, Lyra thought, the most honest thing she had heard a king say in 5 years of pouring his wine. Orson turned to Zephyrin, his quill steady now, his voice smooth as poured cream. "His Majesty welcomes the Duke's terms and looks forward to a swift agreement." Lyra's jaw tightened. Valor's grief, his dead soldiers, his burned villages, his entire reason for wanting peace, reduced to a pleasantry, erased, as if it had never been spoken at all. Zephyrin answered, and in the old tongue his words were lazy with contempt. "Tell him we accept his sentiment. Sentiment costs nothing." Orson bowed his head toward Valor. "The Duke says he is deeply moved, Your Majesty. He shares your hope for lasting peace." 2 lies now, stacked one atop the other, and Valor's face, Lyra could see it from her corner, softened with something dangerously close to relief. He believed he was being understood. He believed his grief had landed somewhere it mattered. The negotiations continued, and Lyra kept her private ledger running beneath her calm exterior, watching the gap between truth and translation widen with every exchange. Valor offered joint patrol of the trade routes. Orson rendered it to Zephyrin as sole patrol rights granted to the northern courts. Zephyrin demanded tribute disguised as a wedding gift for a niece who didn't exist. Orson softened it to Valor as a token gesture of goodwill, easily met. Valor asked, plainly, whether any of Zephyrin's soldiers had already crossed into Crimson territory. Orson translated the question into something closer to a compliment on the Duke's discipline, and answered Valor himself, in the king's own tongue, that no such crossing had occurred. A fabrication Zephyrin hadn't even been asked to confirm. 6 lies now, each one small enough to survive scrutiny. Each one a stone laid carefully into a wall Valor couldn't see being built around him. Lyra pressed her back against the cool stone of the pillar and made herself breathe. She had thought, an hour ago, that the danger here was political. Borders and trade routes, the ordinary cruelty of powerful men. She understood now that it was something colder. Every lie Orson spoke wasn't reshaping a treaty. It was reshaping a man's understanding of the world around him, one gentle sentence at a time, until he would walk willingly into whatever waited for him at the end of it. She thought of Valor's voice describing Ashvale, the boys who'd never held a blade. She thought of how badly he wanted this to be real. It made her chest ache in a way she hadn't expected. Not fear for herself, though. That fear was there too, coiled tight beneath her ribs, but something closer to grief on his behalf. He deserved to know what was actually being said in his own hall, at his own table, in his own name. She became aware, gradually, of eyes on her. Lord Cerridon Valecrest had not spoken more than a dozen words all evening. He sat at Zephyrin's left hand, pale and still, his silver hair catching the candlelight, his gaze moving across the hall with the unhurried patience of a man who had already accounted for every possible danger in the room. The guards, the doors, the loyal nobles, the layout of every exit. Lyra had learned, in 5 years of service, that Cerridon was the kind of creature who noticed things other people didn't bother to look at. He was looking at her now, not with suspicion. Not yet. His expression held nothing so sharp as that. It was closer to idle curiosity, the way a man might glance twice at a piece of furniture that had been moved an inch from where he remembered it. Lyra had lingered near the high table longer than a serving maid needed to. She had refilled the same goblets more than once. She had, without meaning to, allowed her body to angle itself toward the conversation instead of away from it, the way any properly trained servant would. She lowered her eyes at once, resumed the soft, unhurried rhythm of her work, moved 3 steps farther down the table to refill a goblet that didn't need refilling. When she risked a glance back a moment later, Saradin's attention had drifted elsewhere, back to Zephyrin, back to the slow architecture of the evening's deception. He suspected nothing. Not yet. But she understood, with a cold clarity that settled somewhere beneath her sternum, that she had just made her first mistake, and that a man like Saradin did not forget the shape of a mistake once he'd seen it. She forced her hand steady around the decanter and kept moving. At the far end of the hall, the great doors opened and a hush spread through the assembled nobles like water, finding the lowest point in a room. 2 attendants entered bearing a long case of black lacquered wood, banded in gold, carried between them with the solemn care of men bearing a coffin. They set it down at the center of the table, before Valor, before Zephyrin, before the watching eyes of 100 years of history. The case opened. Candlelight caught the parchment inside, ancient and cream-colored, sealed at its edges with wax the color of old blood. The blood covenant had entered the hall. The blood covenant lay open beneath the candlelight, its wax seals unbroken, waiting. A hush had settled over the hall the way frost settles over still water. Quiet, complete, and somehow colder than the silence before it. Lyra remained at her post near the pillar. Decanter balanced against her forearm and watched the case of black lacquered wood as if it were a live thing. Valor rose to address the hall, his voice carrying the practiced warmth of a man closing decades of grief with a single signature. "Let it be known," he said, "that on this night the houses of Duscran and Morvain set aside the swords of our fathers and take up the pen instead." The nobles murmured their approval. Somewhere behind Lyra, goblets clinked in premature celebration. Beneath the sound of it, in the old tongue, Zephyrin leaned toward Kedrick and Saradin, his voice pitched low enough that it should have vanished beneath the noise of the hall. It did not vanish for Lyra. "The moment his hand leaves the parchment," Zephyrin murmured, "the doors seal. Our men are already positioned. 6 in the guards' mess, disguised as kitchen staff, 4 more among the musicians in the gallery. The instant the wax is pressed, they move." He turned his goblet slowly in his fingers, unhurried, admiring. "No blade is drawn until the ink is dry. We wanted this legally binding before we made it a massacre." Kydrick's jaw worked, his hand flexing near his belt where no weapon should have been permitted inside the hall, and yet somehow was. "Why wait for the ink at all?" he said, low and impatient. "Kill him now. Kill him while he's smiling." "Because," Saradin said, and it was the most words Lyra had heard him speak all evening, each one measured and precise. "A signed treaty means the northern courts inherit the southern trade lanes by law, not conquest. A dead king before the signature only earns us a war we would still have to win. A dead king after the signature earns us an empire we've already been handed." He did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "We have spent 4 years placing men inside this court. Lord Bracknell's steward answers to us. 2 of the guard captains owe debts only we were willing to forgive. Even the musician's master was purchased 18 months ago, though he thinks he was merely hired." He glanced, briefly, almost lazily, across the hall, and Lyra felt the floor tilt beneath her when his gaze passed within a hand's width of her own face. "We do not improvise, Kedrick. We have never needed to." The wine in Lyra's hands felt suddenly, impossibly heavy. 4 years. Not a scheme born of tonight's opportunity. Not a desperate gamble by a cornered house. A design built patiently, brick by brick, while Valor spent those same 4 years believing the North was finally softening toward peace. Every kindness Zephyrin had shown, every gift, every warm letter exchanged between courts, had been mortar for this exact night. And there were nobles in this very hall, men and women Valor trusted, men and women who had eaten at his table for years, who were already counted among the dead king's inheritors. Orson, standing at Valor's shoulder with his ledger open, translated none of this. He translated nothing at all, because Zephyrin had not addressed the king. The conspiracy didn't need Orson's lies here. It needed only his silence, his continued presence as proof that everything remained as it should. Lyra understood, watching him, that Orsine's trembling hands were not the tremor of a man about to be caught. They were the tremor of a man who already knew exactly what came after the signature, and had made his peace with delivering Valor to it. She pressed her spine against the pillar and made herself breathe evenly, the way she had trained herself to do through 5 years of invisible service. But there was no training for this. No lesson her grandmother had given her in all those candlelit nights of forbidden language had prepared her for standing 8 feet from a king and watching his murder assembled in real time, sentence by patient sentence, while she alone understood every word of it. If I speak, she thought, they execute me before I finish the sentence. Sephirin's men are already in the room. Saradin already suspects something is wrong with the girl who lingers too long near the high table. One word in the old tongue from my mouth, and I am a corpse before Valor even turns his head. If I stay silent, he signs. And when he signs, the doors seal, and men who wear kitchen aprons draw blades instead of ladles, and men who play violins in the gallery draw crossbows instead, and by the time the candles gutter out tonight, this hall will be a slaughterhouse. Not just Valor. Thane and Varric, who have no idea the threat isn't standing in front of them, the nobles too foolish or too honest to be part of the plot, every servant, caught between the doors when they seal. She thought of her mother in the lower quarter, who believed her daughter poured wine for a living and nothing more. She thought of her grandmother's voice, worn thin at the end. One day, words will become sharper than swords. She had thought, as a child, it was only a saying. It was not a saying. It was an instruction she had been given 10 years too early to understand, and tonight was the night it had finally arrived to collect its debt. Across the table, Valor turned back to the assembled hall, his expression unguarded in a way Lyra had rarely seen from him, hopeful, almost boyish beneath 347 years of weariness. He looked for just a moment like a man who believed the worst chapter of his life was finally closing. "Bring the covenant forward," he said. The attendants lifted the parchment from its case and laid it flat before him, smoothing its edges with reverent care. Someone placed a quill of black feather and silver nib into a waiting inkwell beside his hand. Valor looked once toward Zephyrin, who met his gaze with a warmth so convincing that even Lyra, who knew every lie beneath it, felt the pull of it. Then the king reached forward, his fingers closing around the quill, and lowered his hand toward the parchment. The quill hovered above the parchment, black feather trembling faintly in a king's steady hand, and the entire hall seemed to lean forward with him. Lyra moved. She did not decide to move so much as discover that her feet had already started the crystal decanter, cool and heavy in her grip, her steps falling into the same soft, practiced rhythm she had used 1,000 nights before. Nobody looked at her. That was the whole design of who she was in this room. A shape that passed between candlelight and shadow, present the way furniture was present, noticed only in its absence. Sephirin's eyes stayed fixed on Valor's hand. Saradin stayed fixed on the doorways. Kadric stayed fixed on nothing at all, restless, waiting for the signal that would let him finally move. Orson stared at his ledger as though it might absolve him. Nobody watched the maid. She reached Valor's side. The king's goblet sat half full, catching the candlelight in a dark red circle, and she lifted the decanter and tilted it forward, wine falling in a thin, silent stream, filling it the rest of the way. Her hand did not shake. She had promised herself, somewhere in the 8 steps it took to cross the hall, that her hand would not shake, and it did not. She did not look at him. "Your royal scribe lied," she said. It was barely a whisper, less than a whisper, a breath shaped into words pitched to carry no farther than the space between her mouth and his ear. The same careful economy of motion she used to set down a plate or clear a glass. 5 words. The whole of her 5 years of invisibility spent to purchase them. The quill stopped. It did not fall. It simply stopped, suspended an inch above the parchment, black feather perfectly still in a hand that had not trembled through 3 decades of war councils and now would not move at all. The silence that followed was not the ordinary silence of a hall between courses. It was absolute, a silence with weight, the kind that pressed down from the vaulted ceiling and settled over every candle flame until even the fire seemed to hold its breath. Conversations died mid-syllable at the far ends of the table. A goblet, lifted halfway to some noble's lips, stayed there, forgotten. The musicians in the gallery let their bows drift to a stop against the strings, unsure why the room beneath them had gone so still, only certain that it had. Valor did not gasp. He did not startle, did not knock the wine, did not do any of the things 347 years should have trained out of a lesser man, faced with the impossible. He simply set the quill down with exquisite care, exactly parallel to the edge of the blood covenant, and turned his head. Slowly, His eyes found Lyra's, really found them, for what might have been the first time in 5 years of her pouring his wine, and there was nothing in his expression yet. No anger, no fear, only the terrible, patient attention of a man who had survived 3 centuries by never reacting to anything before he understood it fully. "What did you say?" he asked. His voice was calm. That was the worst part of it, Lyra thought. Worse than shouting would have been. Worse than the guards' hands that had already begun drifting toward the hilts at their belts. A calm voice from a king was not the voice of a man who had misheard. It was the voice of a man who intended to hear it again, correctly, before he decided what it would cost her. Down the table. Zephyrin's smile had not moved, but something behind his eyes had gone very still, very fast. Saradin's gaze had already found her, fully now, no longer idle, no longer a glance that mistook her for furniture, moved an inch from where he remembered it. Orson had gone the color of old parchment, his ledger forgotten in his lap, his mouth opening and finding nothing to say. Lyra kept her eyes lowered, the way 5 years of training demanded, even now, even with the full weight of a king's attention pressing down on her like a hand on the back of her neck. She set the decanter down on the table. It made a soft sound against the wood, small and ordinary, absurdly gentle, for the moment it belonged to. Then she lifted her chin, and for the first time in the whole of her service in the Crimson Palace, she looked directly into King Valar Duscrin's eyes. "Your royal scribe lied, your majesty," she said again. Steady this time, no longer a whisper. "He has been lying to you all night." The hall broke, not into violence, not yet, but into something almost as loud, gasps rippling down the length of the table chairs, creaking as nobles turned to stare. A rising murmur of disbelief and alarm that swelled and collided with itself until the vaulted ceiling seemed to hum with it. Someone demanded to know who the girl was. Someone else called for the guards. Thane and Varric shifted at the base of the throne, hands finding their weapons, though no enemy had yet revealed itself, uncertain whether the threat stood in front of them or somewhere they couldn't yet see. Zephyrin rose halfway from his seat, his composure cracking at the edges for the first time all evening. Cadric's hand closed fully around the hilt at his belt. Saradin alone remained seated, motionless, his pale eyes fixed on Lyra with an intensity that promised he was already recalculating everything he thought he knew about tonight. And Orson, trusted, gentle, 30-year Orson, sat frozen beside the king he had betrayed, his ledger sliding from his lap to the marble floor, forgotten. Valar raised one hand, and the hall, trained by decades of obedience, went silent again, almost as quickly as it had erupted. He looked at Lyra. He did not look away. The silence held. Valier's raised hand kept it suspended. 100 nobles caught mid-breath, mid-motion, waiting on their king, the way the tide waits on the moon. He studied Lyra for a long moment, his ancient eyes moving over her face as if searching for the seam where a lie might show itself. She did not look away. She had spent 5 years perfecting the art of being unseen. She found standing in the full weight of his attention that she had no practice at all in being seen, and it took everything in her not to tremble under it. Then Valar did something that made the hall's held breath catch even harder. He spoke to her in the ancient blood tongue. "Where did his servant learn the language of kings?" he asked, the old syllables rolling low and precise off his tongue, a test disguised as a question. No maid, no commoner, nobody outside the royal bloodlines was meant to understand a word of it. If she answered in the common tongue, confused, he would know she had guessed at Orson's betrayal by instinct alone, a lucky suspicion, nothing more. If she understood and answered correctly, there would be no explaining it away. Down the table, Zephyrin went very still. Saradin leaned forward a fraction of an inch, the first genuine motion Lyra had seen from him all night. Lyra lifted her chin. "My grandmother taught me," she answered, in the same forbidden tongue, each syllable careful and unhurried, the accent her grandmother had drilled into her through 100 candlelit winters. "She was royal translator before me, your majesty, 30 years past. She believed the palace would one day need someone who could hear what it was actually being told." A ripple moved through the hall. Not sound, exactly, but something felt. 100 bodies shifting at once as the impossible settled into truth. Valar did not blink. "Then you will prove it," he said. "Repeat to me what the Duke said to Lord Saradin, not 10 minutes past, when I offered my terms for the trade routes." Lyra's pulse hammered, but her voice did not shake. The Duke said, "Tell him we accept his sentiment. Sentiment costs nothing, and Orson told you the Duke was deeply moved and shared your hope for lasting peace. A noble somewhere down the table made a sound like the air had been struck from him. Repeat what was said of the trade patrols. Vaylor commanded quieter now, and something in his voice had begun to change. Not disbelief anymore, but the low, grinding sound of a king realizing exactly how long he had been standing in the dark. You offered joint patrol of the routes, Lyra said. The scribe told the Duke you had granted sole patrol rights to the northern courts. The tribute. There is no niece, your majesty. The wedding gift was tribute, dressed in kinder words. And tonight, Vaylor's voice had gone to something almost gentle, almost unbearably so. The voice of a man asking the question he already dreaded the answer to. What did the Duke say of tonight? Lyra held his gaze. He said, he signs tonight. He dies before sunrise. And Orson told you it was the beginning of an eternal friendship. The hall did not gasp this time. It went utterly, completely silent, the kind of silence that came after shock had already burned through and left only the cold understanding beneath it. A sound broke that silence, not from the crowd, but from Orson. He had sunk from his chair to his knees beside the king's throne, his ledger long forgotten on the marble, his hands pressed against his face. When he finally spoke, his voice came apart at every seam. Forgive me, Vaylor, your majesty. Forgive me, I never wanted... His breath caught, ragged, 30 years of composure dissolving in front of the entire court. 2 years ago, Zephyrin's men took my sister and her children from the border villages. He sends me a letter every season. Proof, they still breathe. One mistranslation, he told me. One kindness with words, and my family stays alive another season. He looked up, and his eyes were wrecked, ancient grief finally given permission to surface. I did not choose to betray you, my king. I chose which people I could bear to lose. The silence that followed was different again, heavier, with something Lyra had not expected to feel, toward the man who had spent the evening quietly dismantling a kingdom's peace. Pity, sharp and unwelcome, tangled up with the horror of everything else. Zephyrin had risen fully from his seat now, all pretense of warmth gone from his face, his eyes moving across the hall with the speed of a man recalculating a plan that had taken years to build and was unraveling in the span of a single conversation. Ceriden's stillness had cracked entirely. He was already scanning the exits, already counting guards, already understanding that the 4 years of careful placement behind him meant nothing if the king walked out of this hall alive and aware. Enough, Zephyrin said, his voice sharp now, stripped of its diplomat's polish. This is a servant's fantasy, a trick, nothing more. It is the truth. Vaylor said, and though his voice remained low, it carried through the hall like a blade drawn slowly from its sheath. And you know it, Duke, because I have just repeated your own words back to you in your own tongue. Cadric's patience, thin all evening, finally broke. His hand closed around the hilt at his belt, steel beginning to clear its scabbard with a sound that cut through the silence like a scream. Steel cleared its scabbard, and the Crimson Throne Hall stopped being a feast. Cadric lunged first, a blur of black and silver aimed straight for Vaylor's throne, and in the same breath, the disguise of the evening peeled away all at once. The kitchen staff clustered near the side doors dropped their trays and drew blades that had no business in a serving apron. Musicians in the gallery let their instruments clatter to the floor and lifted crossbows instead, the soft strains of the evening's jazz replaced by the dry click of strings being drawn taut. 6 men, then 4 more. Zephyrin's small army, seated through the palace over 4 patient ears, revealed itself in the space of a single heartbeat. Thane and Varric moved before Lyra's mind had fully caught up to what was happening. They crossed in front of the throne in a single fluid motion, steel already drawn, forming a wall of muscle and loyalty between their king and the blade streaking toward him. Cadric's sword met Thane's in a shower of sparks that lit the underside of the gold chandeliers. And the sound of it, a shriek of metal on metal, seemed to unlock every frozen body in the hall at once. Chaos broke loose in every direction. Nobles screamed and scrambled from their seats, overturning chairs, sending crystal goblets shattering across the black marble. A table went over near the east wall, its feast crashing down in a spray of silver and porcelain, and Lyra watched a decanter of blood wine burst against the floor, its dark red contents fanning out across the stone in a pattern that looked in the flickering candlelight exactly like what it was about to become. Candles toppled from their stands as guests fled past them, flame catching briefly at the hem of a fallen banner before someone stamped it out. Smoke curled up toward the Gothic arches. Lyra pressed herself back against the pillar, the same pillar that had hidden her for 5 years of invisible service, and understood with sudden, terrible clarity that invisibility would not save her tonight. A crossbow bolt from the gallery hissed past her shoulder and buried itself in the stone behind her, close enough that she felt the wind of it against her cheek. She dropped instinct overriding thought and crawled beneath the nearest overturned table as the sounds of battle rose around her. Steel on steel, the wet gasp of a noble who hadn't moved fast enough. Cadric's furious shouting somewhere near the throne. Across the hall, Saradin had not drawn a blade at all. He stood near the great doors with the terrible calm of a man watching a storm he had personally summoned, directing his hidden soldiers with small, precise gestures. 2 fingers toward the east exit, a flat palm toward the gallery, a closed fist that sent 3 of the disguised kitchen staff converging on a cluster of nobles Lyra recognized as Vaylor's most loyal advisors. He was not fighting. He was orchestrating 4 years of planning into its final bloody movement, his pale eyes tracking every collapse and surge of the battle with the patience of a man rearranging furniture. And then Vaylor moved. Lyra had served him wine for 5 years, and never once seen him rise from his throne in anger. She understood, in the space of the next several seconds, exactly why every vampire in the northern courts spoke his name with careful respect. He came off the throne like something unleashed, rather than risen, crossing the space between himself and the nearest assassin, with a speed that blurred the eye, and when his hand closed around the man's throat, there was no hesitation in it, no ceremony. Only 347 years of restraint finally given permission to end. He did not draw a blade. He did not need one. The assassin was on the ground before Thane had even finished parrying Cadric's second strike, and Vaylor turned toward the next threat with the same terrible economy, his crimson crown still steady on his head amid the chaos, as though the battle itself did not merit the indignity of disorder. "Protect the eastern nobles," he roared, his calm finally breaking into something fierce, and Varric peeled away from the throne to answer the command, cutting a path through 2 of Zephyrin's disguised soldiers with brutal efficiency. Lyra, still crouched beneath the ruined table, watched Cadric drive Thane backwards step by step, blood, real blood, not spilled wine, beginning to darken the black marble in earnest now. She watched Orson, forgotten in the chaos, crawl toward the pillar nearest the throne, sobbing, cradling nothing, a broken man with nowhere left to hide, and she watched Zephyrin. The Duke had abandoned any pretense of diplomacy the moment Cadric's blade cleared its scabbard. He was moving now, not toward the fight, not toward Saradin's careful orchestration of it, but toward the smaller side doors near the servants' passage, his warm diplomat smile gone entirely, replaced by the cold calculation of a man who understood faster than anyone else in the hall that his 4 years of patient planning had collapsed in the space of a single conversation. He did not look back at Cadric, still locked in combat with Thane. He did not look back at Saradin, still directing the chaos with terrible precision. He did not look back at Vaylor, cutting a path of ruthless efficiency through his hired soldiers. Zephyr Mervain slipped toward the servant's door, and for the first time all evening he began, very quietly, to run. Zephyrin made it 3 steps past the servant's door before Varric caught him. The Duke had counted on the chaos to cover his escape, on every eye in the hall being fixed on steel and blood and screaming nobles, but Varric had been trained for exactly this, the quiet exit, while the loud fight held everyone's attention, and he closed the distance in a heartbeat, his blade coming to rest at the hollow of Zephyrin's throat before the Duke's hand had even finished reaching for the door's handle. "Your Majesty," Varric called across the hall, his voice cutting to the dying clamor of battle. The Duke wished to leave early. Cadric fell not long after, driven to his knees by Thane's relentless assault, his sword skittering across the marble and coming to rest against an overturned chair. He did not surrender so much as run out of strength to keep fighting, chest heaving, blood, his own, this time darkening his sleeve where Thane's blade had found him. Saradin was the last to be taken, and it happened with none of the violence that had claimed the others. He stood near the eastern wall as Vaylor approached him directly, the king's guards fanning out behind him to close off every possible route of retreat. And Saradin, pale, precise, calculating even now, simply lowered the hand that had been gesturing his soldiers into position, and let it fall to his side. There was no fight left in the math. He had built his plan on 4 years of patience, and patience meant nothing against a king who was still breathing. "You've cornered me, Your Majesty," Cerdin said quietly, "but you haven't won anything. There will be others." "Perhaps," Valor said. "Tonight, there is only you?" The hall, what remained of it, had gone quiet in a different way now. Not the frozen silence of shock, but the exhausted stillness that follows violence. Nobles clutching torn sleeves in overturned chairs, servants beginning hesitantly to right the wreckage of a feast that had nearly become a massacre. Orson had not moved from where he knelt by the pillar. Lyra emerged from beneath the ruined table, her legs unsteady beneath her, and found her eyes drawn to him before anything else. The trusted scribe, 30 years in the king's service, folded in on himself like something broken beyond repair. Valor crossed to him slowly, the fury that had carried him through the battle draining out of his shoulders with each step, replaced by something heavier and far more complicated. Orson did not wait to be asked. 2 years ago, he said, his voice raw, barely holding together, Duke Zephyran's men crossed into the eastern villages during the harvest raids. My sister was there, her children. He pressed a trembling hand against his mouth for a moment before he could continue. He sent me a letter that winter, proof they were alive. He told me one small kindness with words, one gentle mistranslation here, one softened phrase there, and my family would live another season. I told myself I could manage it. I told myself I could bend enough sentences to keep them breathing without breaking anything that truly mattered. His shoulders shook. I was wrong. I see that now. I have been wrong for 2 years, and I let it grow, sentence by sentence, until it became this. The hall listened in a silence that had shifted again. No longer horror, but something closer to grief. The particular ache of watching a good man's slow ruin laid bare. I do not ask for mercy, Orson whispered. I ask only that you know I never stopped loving this kingdom, even while I was helping to burn it down. Valor stood over him for a long moment, and Lyra, watching, braced herself for the sentence she assumed must follow. Execution. Exile. Some punishment fit for 30 years of trust spent on betrayal. Instead, the king knelt, so that he and his scribe were level with one another, and rested a hand on Orson's shoulder. He will not die tonight, Valor said quietly. A man who sold his honor to save his family did not sell it cheaply. That is not the same as a man who sold it for gold. He paused. But you will help me undo what you have done. Every treaty, every letter, every word you twisted. We will unwind it together, and you will spend whatever years you have left proving the man I trusted for 30 years is still somewhere inside you. Orson wept into his hands, and this time the sound of it was not despair, but something closer to relief. Valor rose and turned, finally, to Lyra. The hall's attention followed him, 100 nobles watching the maid who had unmade a conspiracy, with 5 whispered words, and Lyra felt the full weight of being seen settle over her again, heavier than before. You risked everything, Valor said, for a king who did not know your name until an hour ago. Why? Lyra held his gaze, steady now in a way she would not have believed herself capable of 5 years into a life spent disappearing. Because betrayal destroys everyone, Your Majesty, she said. Not just kings. Something in Valor's expression shifted. Not surprise exactly, but the particular stillness of a man hearing a truth land exactly where it needed to. He studied her a moment longer, the ruins of the feast scattered around them, candlelight flickering over broken glass and darkened marble. Walk with me, he said quietly, low enough that it did not carry beyond the two of them. Not as a servant tonight. I find I have grown tired of listening to voices that only tell me what I want to hear. He held out his hand, an invitation rather than a command. Stay beside me, Lyra Viral. I find I would like to know what the truth sounds like. Spoken plainly, for the first time in a very long while. Lyra took the king's outstretched hand, and something in the hall seemed to shift with the gesture. 100 nobles watching a maid step, for the first time, out from behind the furniture of her own life. It took 3 days to rebuild what one night had nearly destroyed. The blood covenant taken apart clause by clause was rewritten in the light of morning rather than the shadows of a rigged banquet, this time with every word spoken in the old tongue translated aloud twice, once by Lyra, and once for verification cross-checked against Orson's careful notes. Zephyran's captured lieutenants, eager to trade information for mercy, confirmed every hidden garrison, every bribed noble, every false promise threaded through 4 years of careful deception. What emerged from the wreckage was not the treaty Zephyran had engineered, but something closer to what Valor had wanted from the very beginning. Open borders, honest trade, protection owed equally in both directions. When the Northern Court sent a new delegation to finalize the terms, the Great Hall filled again, candles lit, banners hung, the same Gothic arches watching over a very different kind of feast. This time, when the ancient blood tongue rolled across the room in formal greeting, it was Lyra who stood at the king's shoulder to answer it, not hidden by a pillar, not clutching a decanter, but standing openly in a role that had no precedent in the history of the Crimson Palace. She translated perfectly. Every clause, every counteroffer, every careful diplomatic phrase passed through her without a single word bent out of shape. The visiting delegates, unaware they were watching the same Maid who had unraveled a conspiracy weeks before, saw only a translator of rare precision. The nobles who had been present that night saw something else entirely. Proof, spoken aloud in real time, of exactly what had been stolen from them for 30 years and exactly what had been given back. When the final terms were signed, properly, honestly, without a single hidden dagger waiting behind the ink, Valor rose from his throne and addressed the full court. "There is a woman in this hall," he said, "who spent 5 years being taught, by circumstance and by necessity, that survival meant disappearing. Tonight, I correct that." He turned to where Lyra stood, and the entire hall turned with him. Lyra Viral is no longer in the service of this palace as a maid. From this day forward, she serves as official royal translator, keeper of the ancient blood tongue, and my personal advisor in all matters where truth must be weighed against what men wish to hear. A murmur swept the hall. Not the murmur of scandal this time, but something closer to awe. 100 nobles recalculating what they had witnessed weeks earlier in light of what it had actually cost her to speak. Orson, standing at a respectful distance near the pillar that had once hidden his own trembling hands, accepted a different kind of grace. Valor had offered him no throne, no return to his former trust, but a narrower path, a scholarly post in the palace archives, his work reviewed and countersigned by others. His remaining years spent restoring the truthful record of every treaty he had once helped to corrupt. Orson bowed low when it was announced, and if there was grief in the bow, there was also, unmistakably, relief. Thane and Varric were the last to step forward. The 2 guards who had spent 5 years walking past Lyra without truly seeing her crossed the hall together and dropped to one knee before her, swords laid flat across their palms in the formal salute reserved for those who had earned the crown's trust through blood or courage. "My lady," Thane said, and the title landed strangely and rightly all at once. The court erupted, not into the shocked silence of that first terrible night, but into applause, warm and sustained, echoing up through the vaulted arches until it seemed the whole palace had finally exhaled. Later, once the hall had emptied and the candles burned low and steady rather than flickering with panic, Lyra found herself standing beside Valor on the balcony overlooking the Crimson Kingdom. The same balcony where distant spires had once framed a night of celebration that nearly became a slaughter. The sky beyond the towers had begun to soften from black to deep indigo, the first pale threads of dawn tracing themselves along the horizon. "For years," Valor said quietly, "this palace taught you to disappear." Lyra allowed herself a faint smile. "It was the safest way to survive. Not anymore." He turned from the view to face her fully, and something in his ancient eyes had settled into a kind of peace she hadn't seen in him before, not even in the moments he'd spoken most passionately of ending centuries of war. Then he turned toward the hall behind them, toward the last lingering nobles who had not yet retired, and raised his voice to Carrie. "For years this kingdom never saw the woman who carried its future in silence," he said. "Today, every noble here will remember that peace was not saved by the strongest sword in this hall. It was saved by the courage of one honest voice." The remaining nobles inclined their heads, and this time no one mistook the gesture for mere formality. Lyra turned back toward the balcony, toward the horizon where the first true rays of sunrise had begun to paint the distant towers in shades of crimson and gold, the same colors that had named this kingdom for longer than she had been alive. She thought of her grandmother's voice, worn thin in that last winter, warning her that words would one day become sharper than swords. She understood now, fully, what that warning had cost, and what it had bought. The servant who had once survived by becoming invisible stood in the open morning light beside her king, no longer behind him, no longer hidden by pillars or decanters or lowered eyes. The blood covenant, once forged to seal a betrayal, would carry her name instead. The first stone lay toward a peace built, finally, on truth.